everyone. This is Diane Rasmussen McAdie with UK Column News, and I'm delighted to be talking today with Hugh McCarthy, who is a former teacher and has years of experience in the education system. Hugh, would you like to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background, please?
Yes, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Diane. It looks as if we weren't too much help to either Scotland or Ireland against France at the weekend, but maybe we'll leave that one. As you can see, or perhaps here, I'm in Northern Ireland. I've had 53 years of experience in education. Maybe I look like that. 23 of them as a head teacher. Round about my retirement time, I also lectured in the University of Ulster. I served on two of Northern Ireland's education councils, most recently as a ministerial appointee. And I write a Substack, Hugh's newsletter. It's got 75 published articles, including the most recent one with yourselves. And I'm married, 3 children, and I like football and rugby and cricket and not gardening.
Thanks for that. What subjects did you teach when you were a teacher?
Well, I'm qualified in chemistry, so it was largely chemistry, but also physics and maths. As possibly is the case, I didn't teach a lot. When I was a head teacher, I found the interruptions were too much. But once again, it was science I taught, yeah.
And so was all of your experience in Northern Ireland when you were in the education system? Or were you working in other places as well?
No, all my experience has been in Northern Ireland. I am a member of a couple of international organisations and I've visited schools here, there and everywhere. But like everywhere, our system is unique and you need an inside information in order to deal with it.
So how is the Northern Ireland system, how does it compare to the other devolved nations in the UK?
I think the largest difference, well, there are two main differences. One is we still have selection at 11, 10 actually it is. Although I was principal of a non-selective school, a unique area called the Dixon Plan actually, which is in Craigavon or Portadown in Lurgan. So that's the main difference. There's a lot of controversy over that. So we still have grammar schools, half the system. The second difference is we are church-based. Because of our history, we have essentially two main systems. One controlled and managed and owned by the Catholic Church, and the other one controlled and managed by the state. So they're roughly the same size. I think the other main difference is that our parents here, although they don't realize it, have a lot more power than is the case in the other devolved nations. And that's down to a document called the Education Reform Order, which I just happen to have here. This is the bedrock of our parents' authority, and I've concentrated a lot on trying to explain parent rights. As you know, the education system can be, like many systems, difficult to deal with.
Can you summarize that a little bit for us?
Well, the Education Reform Order was 1989 was part of the Margaret Thatcher revolution to privatise or semi-privatise the public sector. And the thrust of it was to introduce competition. As you know, she believed that competition raised standards, and that included health, trains, transport, and education. So the biggest single thing that it was introduced was open enrollment. Prior to that in Northern Ireland, children went to the local school, and that was it. Open enrollment meant you could choose schools, and that choice then was to be based on information. And the second parallel was that the school funding was to be based on the number of children attending the school. The theory was that good schools would prosper, that more parents would choose those schools, and that those schools would thereby get more funding. And because of the competition, schools would have to try a lot harder and to be a lot more responsive to the wishes of their parents and to the local community. And that's the thrust of what I think we're about to talk about, responsive to the wishes of the local community.
Yeah. And something as a member of the Scottish Union for Education, I'm quite aware of the challenges that have been happening in Scotland the past few years of the PISA scores decreasing and so on, which has been obviously great concern to parents who are paying attention and to us in the SUE group. Has it been a similar situation in Northern Ireland, or do you think that this policy has helped with that over time?
I'll say about the situation as far as I know it. Northern Ireland, to the best of my knowledge, is unique. Our parents are entitled to know the curriculum. They are entitled to be consulted on changes to the curriculum. They are entitled to sit on our boards of governors, which determines the curriculum. Now, it is true that one of the political parties' alliance, and indeed the Northern Ireland Children's Commissioner, wishes that those parental rights to be greatly diminished, including the right of parents to remove their children from lessons with which they do not agree. And those four rights are crucial to the campaigns that are being organised under SUE, under Public Protection Wales, Kim Isherwood, and indeed here under a group called the Family Education Trust. And if I might just say, Diane, the Family Education Trust is holding a conference on the 7th of April at 7 o'clock in the Lisburn Vic Ryan Conference Centre. And interested people can contact Lucy.Marsh at the Family Education Trust. They will hear a lot more material about their rights, material such as I've been speaking and distributing to various parent groups throughout Northern Ireland. We are fortunate in that the education ministry in our devolved system the minister is currently very much of a mind that you would be, that I would be, that material under the amended RSA has no place in schools. And so is the new chief executive and chair of our education authority. They are of the same mind, and not the mind of several of the political parties, I have to say, in our convoluted system. But that is important, and it is a change from the previous ministry.
So I'll come back to that in just a minute. Related to that as well is just generally speaking, I'm wondering about the standards in Northern Ireland and whether things like the PISA scores have gone down in the past few years, because I know that they certainly have in Scotland.
The Northern Ireland system is designed to be portable in England and Wales. As you may know, exams are not criterion referenced, they're norm referenced, which means pass marks go up and down, which means percentage of grades can be adjusted. Now, in terms of our exams and exams in England, because a lot of our children go to university in England, they did go to Scotland, but that's much less so now. In terms of research, it is true that the PISA results, which include Northern Ireland, have fallen. That would be literacy and numeracy, principally. And how could they not? You close schools for 2 years. How could reading standards not have fallen? I had a very interesting exchange with the Department of Education, actually, a direct conversation in which the assertion was made that our reading standards had only fallen by a month. Now, that's nonsense. Why would you, if you close schools for 2 years and reading standards don't fall, schools are not doing a lot of good. So in terms of standards across Northern Ireland, it is very difficult to get specific information pertaining to Northern Ireland. It is coupled with the English standards, and as you know, the English standards have fallen. They were at the lowest since 2009, the same as the American NIPS test, the lowest, I think, on their history. And anecdotally, i.e., talking to teachers, um, standards of speech and language, standards of development have all fallen in line with the finding of the great Ormond Street professor, or Dr. Golden, who found that they were down by 2 years. That's a broad answer, but it's the answer I have.
That's pretty much what I expected. I just wanted to get it out there because it is such an important point. I saw it myself as well when I was teaching university, which I did through last year before I joined UK Column full time. And I would also have to say that just the kinds of students that we were having coming in, starting in 2020 through 2024, they were not prepared in many ways in the same way that they were up to 2019. They, including socially, they can't pay attention to a lecture. It doesn't hold their attention any longer. The quality of their work has gone way down. Their ability to withstand any sort of stress or extra work that comes with doing a university degree seems to have also diminished. And it's just truly tragic, I think, what the lockdowns did to the entire world. But when we see it in education, it's particularly sad because these are the people that are preparing to take over the future from us. And they're just not up for it anymore. So I just wanted to see if you've seen something similar, and I expected that you would have. I just think it's important to get out there as much as possible.
Yes, the NFER, the Education Endowment Trust, and mirror Professor Helen, Dr. Golden's findings, that all the way through, at just what you said, all the way through the age group, up until 2022, they've fallen behind. And how could they not? Attendance is down, suspensions are up. We are facing the worst mental health crisis in our history, with 1.4 million children awaiting appointments for mental health. Now, how could they not have mental health? The press is asking ludicrously why. We denied our young people all the things that nurture and protect their mental health. Parties, sport, church, travel, interrelationships. We masked the parents. So, as you rightly point out, and it's the same here, when you affect a person's ability to interrelate, what would you expect to happen? And it's precisely what has happened. They are not mentally resilient in a way that perhaps our generation were. They are not able to cope independently. And we are now finding, now I know it's the other end of the age group, but they're not toileting, they're not able to climb stairs. Their speech is developments at its lowest in history, according to the speech therapist. All those independence, and that just doesn't fall away, because a brain is like, it's like a milk bottle. You can't keep stuffing stuff into it and expect it just to fill up. That's not the way development works.
No, it's truly tragic, and I can only hope that things will get better for students that are even younger. But if it's a matter of them, and I've heard these other stories as well about toilet training and just basic functioning, they're certainly not going to be ready to manage going through an education if they can't even take care of themselves at a very, very basic level. Um, very sad to hear. I guess with the issue with the parents being involved, have you seen as well in the past few years that despite the fact that parents have greater rights in Northern Ireland than maybe they do in the rest of the UK, have you seen that their involvement decreasing in the last few years? Have they sort of become more detached from their children and their education, or has that stayed the same?
Well, it's obviously hard for me to say because I'm no longer in schools. Um, Anecdotally, I don't think that's the case. Certainly, I have tried to act as an advisor to various groups of parents. And I'm finding they're very interested. One of the things that you mentioned, and it struck me with the Curriculum and Examination Council that I was a director on, we were able to speak very little about education matters. What a parent wants is how their child is doing in relation to their peer groups. So how are they reading? How are they behaving? How is their numeracy? How are they learning in relation to their peer group? It is not a finite measure. They just need to know how they're doing in relation to the rest of, and indeed how they are doing in relation to a group 5 years ago. Now, I did find a significant involvement with the parents in the school in which I was principal. I understand that has continued. Parents' evenings and open nights are well attended, and groups that I've been speaking to are very keen on knowing how their child is doing. Whether we're actually delivering at an organizational level, I have campaigned long and hard for a province-wide reading assessment, because reading drives everything. According to the OECD, reading gives you access to education. Numeracy enables you to benefit financially from it. Yet we have no standardized reading test across the province. So nobody really knows how they're doing in relation to the school next door, how they're doing in relation to the rest of the province, how they're doing in relation to last year. And it's crucial. What we were talking about reading earlier on, Diane, and it's very important. Once you reach the age, if you haven't learned to read by the age of about 13, the synopsis sort of cement, and you can't really, it's a law of diminishing returns thereafter. Now, the reading functional literacy is about 85 points on scales and tests which exist. You can shove them up to 90, 95, hundreds of norm. If you get them up to 90, 95, we're in GCSE C level. But if you don't continue to do that, they fall back down. If they fall back down, they haven't got the functional literacy skills needed to live and work. Now, there was a whole cohort in that point score, say from the age of 9 to 12, that desperately needed pushing up in school. The schools were closed and they didn't get it. So there's a whole cohort out there whose reading standards have fallen, and sadly, it's very, very difficult to teach those children to read after 13, and schools are finding that, and society will find it, because those are the children that will have to read instructions about this, that, and the other. And it's very sad. And what I've been writing about, Dan, is would somebody be held responsible for the damage instead of just say, whoa, I don't know how it happened. I know how it happened. You closed schools and you didn't need to. Children weren't at risk. They weren't a risk to other people. Schools should never have closed. And children were, in many times, suffered lifetime damage because of the decisions made by the authorities. And I was not popular in either of the two councils that I sat on for saying so. But I'd like to hold somebody responsible.
At UK Column, we have consistently questioned the narrative that happened in 2020 and beyond, yes, for a lot of reasons. And I believe rightfully so. But even if you look at the UK government's own website, and again, we know that we can't entirely trust what's on the government website. But even there, it said that the survival rate of COVID, if you believe that COVID was a disease and killed people, which not everyone does, but some people do, but even believing their official narrative, they were saying that it had a 97.5% survival rate, and that most people who died from it were elderly, which meant that children were at no risk whatsoever, really, of dying from any sort of respiratory illness, if it did exist. And it certainly should not have closed schools and affected their education. And I heard a lot from parents that I know who had young children at the time who were having difficulties getting them to engage with their education because they were doing these, the online classes, and they were having trouble with getting their children to do their work. And they just wanted to go watch YouTube or whatever they felt like doing. And so they would turn off their cameras that were supposed to be on and go do something else or go to sleep or just completely not be engaged. And I certainly, as difficult as it was for me to teach at university level during that time, I certainly don't envy the teachers who had to live through it either, because I also know some teachers teaching at, in the schools, younger children, that felt just as isolated as anyone did, and they still had to carry on with it. And so I imagine that was a lot of load for them to carry as well, to have to translate into that environment. It was difficult enough when I'm teaching, legal adults at university. So for everyone, it was a terrible, terrible situation to be in. I want to talk a little bit as well about, as you mentioned, you're writing for us right now. For viewers, I'm not sure exactly when this interview will go out live to everyone, but at this point, you have a 3-part series that you're writing about the sexualization of children in schools, which the main title of the 3 parts is What They Didn't Want to Hear. So part 1 has been published, part 2 and part 3 will be coming out about in a couple of weeks. We're going to spread them out a bit so that people have some time to digest the material. Do you want to talk a little bit about what's in that series? Because I personally see connections between what's happened with the COVID era, the closing of schools, and now we have this incredible distraction, this terrible, disgusting distraction of the indoctrination that's going on in the schools, which really cannot lead to anything good in any way, and certainly not for the basics of education that children need to receive. So can you tell us a little bit about your series, please?
I will, and if I can hold both questions in my head, just for those who will listen in Northern Ireland, 273 people died of COVID in 4 years. They died at the same rate as they would have died of flu, except nobody did die of flu. The youngest person to die of COVID in Northern Ireland was 38. Now, where did I get that information? The Department of Health, Northern Ireland, and Cathy Gray, who's a great friend of ours. No healthy child died anywhere in the world that can be traced of COVID. And if there was any transmission, it happened from adult to child. And actually, the sadness of it was that they knew this all along. And there's a 4-part series of mine on UK Column. This was known all along. In fact, our chief medical officer is on record as saying it was nothing, and this is more or less a direct lift, it was nothing to do with the children. It was to keep the parents at home. Now, that is absolutely disgraceful. And in fact, our chief medical officer couldn't and wouldn't answer the simple questions. Why did you close schools? Parents should know that. To answer your direct question about the sexualization of children via the school curriculum, I've got 3 whys here. Why is this a school issue? Why isn't it a health issue? Why should every child be taught this when it's a minority of a minority? And why would you teach it at all? Now, for our people that are listening for the first time, and I'm going to refer to something sitting beside me here, Diane, the WHO-driven government's agenda, which filtered down from the United Nations to the United Kingdom governments, from Westminster into the devolved administrations, from there into the civil service, and then down to the curriculum councils. That's the train that this followed. Now, the WHO guidance, which after a campaign was removed from our website, our curriculum website, some of us spoke out strongly against it. I was one of them. And it's now there. And I would like to think that primary schools in Northern Ireland, parents and head teachers, would check again, because there are many of our primary schools are still using it. It's not there any longer. Now, this is what it said. Bear with me, Diane, because this is important. The WHO published two documents: the WHO Standards for Sexuality Education in Europe and the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education. Now, they're not great reads, but you should read them. I've got some examples. For 6 to 9 year old, the WHO's got two statements. A child is understood to be a sexual being from the beginning. From the beginning. The guidance for 6 to 9 year olds recommends a curriculum content which includes, now the words recommends. Now remember, the curriculum websites for all the devolved administration are the first port of call for teachers, head teachers, and administrators, because they'll just quote this. This is for 6 to 9 year olds. Sexual intercourse, gender orientation, and sexual behavior of young people. Enjoyment and pleasure when touching one's own body, masturbation, self-stimulation, and orgasm. The International Technical Guidance for 5 to 8 year olds state that learners will be able to identify the critical parts of the internal and external genitals and describe their basic function. Moving on to gender. The WHO responds to contemporary global challenges through education with a special focus on gender equality. Sexuality education is firmly based on self-determination and the acceptance of diversity. The curriculum for 6 to 9 year olds, the differences between gender identity and biological sex. For 5 to 8 year olds, define gender and biological sex and describe how they are different. And finally, now there's a lot more, so this is only finally in my notes. Reflect on how they feel about their biological sex and gender. Now, it also recommends that this should be taught in an interactive way. I'm at a loss to how you teach about texting pornography, which is also here, about genitalia in an interactive way. At the very least, it involves very descriptive language and probably photographs or pictures. So once again, and I put this to my board, why would you teach this? And I'm at a loss. I never got an answer. I have put it to our officials. Why would you teach this at all? Why would you teach it in a school? Why would you ask a young child, are you a boy or a girl today? Why would you offer a young child to put on the clothes of the opposite sex in a primary school? Now, I'm not talking hypothetically here. I'm giving examples of what has happened in some of our primary schools. And if it's happened in Northern Ireland, you can be sure it's happening in Scotland, Wales, and England. Why would you do this? Now, the answer given by the Secretary of State at Westminster was reduce unwanted pregnancies and reduce domestic violence. Now, I'm not clear on the connection between what I've just read and the stated aims. And even later, and I know this is a bit of a monologue, but I think it's important, it talks about access to abortion. Now I've got in my head that sexual activity with a minor is a criminal offence. I don't see and I don't see it in any of the websites, big banner that says this is against the law. This is a criminal offence. Now, there are no legal and moral issues on the website unless you choose to bring them in. Now, the evidence presented through CAS, and you might want to ask me about that, through Professor Patton at Westminster, was quite clear. These programs don't deliver. There is no evidence that they work at all. Yet the WHO talks about it evidence-based. Now, I'll go back to the abortion issue. The WHO does say in its small print about the wishes, the social norms of society and the importance of the churches and faith-based organisation. But it gives them in about that. You have to read the 89 pages to see it. The other stuff goes on for page after page after page. Now, actually, I understood, and it's true of the Presbyterian churches as well, that it was a bedrock of the Catholic faith. That the sanctity of holy life was a given. So why are we talking abortion to 11, 12, 13 or 14-year-olds? And yet the Secretary of State talked about unwanted pregnancies and access to abortion taught to youngsters. Now, Northern Ireland, as you know, is a conservative place. Well, at least I thought it was. The other factor, before Anna and I stop after this, 74 of our parents in the official public consultation said no to this. But as we are finding with everything else, Diane, the authorities just roll on as if we don't matter. And I'll pause there because you may have questions based on research or the curriculum or whatever.
Yeah, no, they certainly do whatever they want. And I've seen that not only in this area, but in other areas where I've completed consultations either through the UK government or even Edinburgh City Council where I live, and they just do what they want anyway. The only reason they ask us is to say that they did, but they never actually do what I don't think what the majority of people say they want or don't want. Did you see anything in this report? Because one of the big questions I have with all of these agendas, these evil agendas, is you said that the WHO report claims to be evidence-based, but there was no evidence for it. And I know you've studied this all very carefully. So did you see anything anywhere that says where these ideas come from, or what it is that told the WHO what that we need to be doing these things and providing this information to our children?
Well, I haven't read it. It is true that children take on societal norms from a very early age. There is, shall I say, generic research showing that young children take on, shall we say, sectarianism in Northern Ireland from a very early age. And we do know that the first 5 years of a child's life, 95% of their development takes place. So there is general research pointing at the importance of what happens in their early years. And that's why I'm speaking about it. Because if you normalize what we're talking about here, then a child views it as normal, especially if it comes from an adult in authority. And we do know that separate from the teacher, separate from the child itself, the teacher is the single biggest influence on what a child learns. I think it's 30%, I think it's the research. And we also know as parents that peer group pressure, social media is now shoving the teacher out. So if the teachers talking about this and the trade unions are spreading it too, the Irish National Teacher Organisation, which represents a majority of the teachers in the Catholic sector, incredibly runs training courses in this to it says that teachers should challenge prevailing attitudes to gender. Well, no, they shouldn't. And that is in those articles. I mean, you spoke about Edinburgh. I have experience in Edinburgh. I spoke about what we are doing to our children in Leith with Professor Richard Enos. I couldn't get a hall. I did it in Leith Park so that we wouldn't be silenced completely. What are we doing to our children and why? And this is just another step. And yet our authorities, I have the impression, I raised this at 8 consecutive board meetings to a stony silence. The title refers to the fact that I never got the full opportunity to present the actual science. I had lots of science that showed that the Department of Education was using out of date, to put it kindly, out of date science. Now, did the department sitting beside me like me saying that? No. But if we followed NHS guidance on school closures, why aren't we following the NHS CAS report, which is stating that something up towards 90% of the children, using the time-honoured phrase, grow out of this? And those children who have doubts about their gender, it's research again shows that it's because they've suffered a trauma in their lives. So we're talking about a minority of a minority of a minority. And Dr. Hilary Cass clearly said that clinical management approaches should be how this is handled, where a child is having doubts about their sexuality and their gender. And the other evidence base that Professor Patton and others presented was that in only 6% of the courses ran did they see any difference. It didn't reduce unwanted pregnancies. It didn't reduce the number of partners, but it did. They saw an increase in the number of sexual partners, or they found an increase. And they saw 18% caused great harm. And Professor Patton presented that in Westminster. His research also showed that mandating it for schools made no difference. It made no difference whether there was an opt-out. And that is the current science. And I advise parents to have a look at it. Now, and this is a cynic. In Northern Ireland, parents are proving a block because more and more of them, the way our governors are made up, and this is why I urge all parents to establish who governs their schools and what power they have. Now, in Northern Ireland, there are of the order of 4 parents elected by the parents. There are 4 church representatives, either Catholic church representatives on the Catholic boards or the 3 main Protestant church representatives on the state school boards of governors. Now, there is 8. That's a majority. And the boards of governors represent, or are supposed to represent, local interests. Now, there's a clue in the title. Parent representatives, church representatives. I would advise parents strongly to get in touch with their representatives, because the Northern Ireland representatives, the actual people on the ground, remain conservative with a small c, and they are opposed to this. The governors are opposed to it, the parents are opposed to it, the church representatives are opposed to it. They need the confidence, as Robert Kennedy Sr. said, they need moral courage. And I didn't see much of that on my board, to be honest with you. I know the people on the board didn't agree with it, but I didn't see anybody asking what Hannah Arendt said, why? Stop and think. Why are we doing this? They seem to me just be following some great weight from the sky, when actually we had the authority to say no, just to say no. But what we needed was courage. I'm a member of a retired principals group. There are 10 of us, and we meet regularly. It's cross-community, very healthy. And when I was discussing this and said, why are we doing this? And one of the experienced heads said, fear. They're all afraid to stand up for what is right. They all agree, but they're afraid to stand up. And that's sad. And therefore, they have to be shoved and pushed. And that's where, if parents are not going to do it now, and grandparents are not going to do it now, when are they going to do it? Are they content to let schools separate them from their children? Because children are learning one thing in school and then going home. A couple of the political parties and the usual institutions are saying parents shouldn't have the right, because one of Sue's articles says parents in Scotland will not have the right to withdraw their child because they're integrating it through the entire curriculum. That's not the case in Northern Ireland. It's a freestanding, or currently a freestanding subject, and it's the amended subject I'm talking about. It's freestanding, and therefore a parent can withdraw. But the Alliance Party wants to remove that right, and the Children's Commissioner here wants to remove that right. But they're all paid for by the same global funding that seems to be determining a lot of our policies. I'll stop there. I'm on my soapbox.
No, it's great. It's great. We're here to hear from you. Going back to Cass for just a minute as well. I did interview previously Dr. Jenny Cunningham for UK Column, and we talked about that review from her perspective as a retired pediatrician. And one of the most interesting things that she said about Cass from her perspective was that essentially what they're trying to do is the idea of the medical transition. When we're talking about these gender ideologies, the medical transition is not the answer to what may be a mental health condition. So we're trying to treat a mental health condition by, modifying their bodies in really dangerous and permanently damaging ways, as we know. When you looked at Cass from an educator's perspective, what were the most important things that stood out to you?
Well, what you just said, actually, and it goes further. Every systematic review of the evidence shows that there is no evidence that hormonal transplants solve mental health issues. And you're quite right. What Cass is saying is that there is no evidence that either surgical or hormonal medical treatment has any effect whatsoever, because the evidence shows that suicide rates and mental health issues are higher in the group, not lower. I mean, if it worked, then the original theory was that children who are suffering gender dysphoria were doing so because they were in the wrong body, and that they would lead happier, more fulfilled lives if they underwent hormonal treatment or medical surgery. And it was called the Dutch Protocol. And it was introduced largely by a Finnish doctor known as Kaltiali. Now, she based that on research. Now, Dr. Kaltiali has totally reversed her position. Now, this came via United Nations, the United States, and the Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Baltic countries. They let us in. They're leading out now. Finland, for example, COHER, it's the Finnish National Health Service, has now said, leave all this to post-18. When the person is mature enough to make their own decision. And Kaltiali has now reversed her position. She said her position was based on a biased and flawed set of research papers from a very small cohort. So the whole fundamental tenet is flawed from the science. And that's when I refer to it's using out-of-date science, the Department of Education is using out-of-date science, because the science says the direct opposite to the science that they had used. And you're right, Jenny Cunningham is pediatrician, and she would be typical of the advice that I would be following. But we do know to talk about this at the age where development isn't complete. The children don't understand the concepts involved to make such decisions that will affect them, as Coher said, for the rest of their lives. Why would you do that?
That's really an excellent question. And the only answer that I can come up with is that you're not protecting children the way that you should be. You're not making them aware of what's going to happen to their bodies as they go through puberty. And as you said, once you're over 18, if that's something that you want to do to yourself, then that, in my opinion, that's your choice to do so. That's your right to do with your own body. But when these children are going through it, even before they've reached puberty, and while they're going through it, the permanent damage is not something that they will be able to understand, or maybe even really consider the fact that it will affect their future plans for fertility. They won't be able to be parents themselves. And just the health issues, the side effects of some of the hormonal medications alone, not to mention the surgeries. And once body parts are gone, you can't put them back. You can't change that decision later when you've changed your mind and realized that maybe you shouldn't have done that. But whether or not children are still capable cognitively even of thinking about those decisions long term, I think is something that really needs to be looked at carefully. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right about that. With the parent issue and the board, what exactly is going on there with those interactions? Because if you have small c conservative parents saying, no, we don't want this in our schools, and the board just kind of staying quiet, how does that work? I can't. I'm just trying to picture how that works at a board meeting where they're just afraid to say to the parents, okay, we'll do what you want, when that's supposed to be how it works in Northern Ireland, but they're not doing it. Like, what is going on there exactly?
Board of Governors is one board. I referred to another board. I should really have called it a council. Boards of Governors have the power. When our devolved government collapsed, Northern Ireland was governed by direct rule via a Secretary of State. So when we had our devolved administration called Stormont, when we had no Stormont, the Secretary of State introduced this legislation at Westminster. And you can read about it in the Hansard. He was quite clear in the small print that it must be in line with the ethos of the school. Now, the ethos of the school, he went on to say, is determined by the Board of Governors. Now, the Board of Governors are constituted by churches and local parents. Now, every official body, and I want to make this clear to Northern Ireland parents, where do you get your rights? Where are they derived from, apart from that book that I showed you? Every official body in Northern Ireland, the Secretary of State, the Department of Education, the Education Authority, and the Curriculum Council assert parental rights. So don't be in any doubt. Parental rights and the ethos of the school are paramount, but they're no good unless you assert your rights. The department is telling you all this, but it's saying, oh, you must teach this. But you mustn't. That's the point I'm trying to make. And it's how long is a piece of string? I could teach you about volcanoes in a line or two. Volcanoes erupt, period. I could teach you in a month about volcanoes. And so it is with the legislation. That's why I concentrated on the WHO guidance. The WHO guidance gives you an impression, and it goes on for page after page after page in great detail. These are laid out as learning objectives. These are laid out as lesson plans in great detail. But you don't have to. You can teach it in a sentence or two. And you can teach morality, criminality as well in Northern Ireland. Now, what happens? So, Board of Governors need to take responsibility. That's what they're there for. At the Curriculum Council, I don't know what the Scotland one called. The Welsh one is, what is it, WJEC. The English one is called JQA. Ours is called CEA, CCEA, Curriculum Council Education Assessment. Why that continued? Now, important changes were made to the hub. Scotland's got a hub. Northern Ireland has a hub. Important changes were made to emphasise ethos of the school, parental rights, the removal of WHO guidance. That's very important. Very important for parents. However, the department sits on the council. Senior official sits on the council. And the Department of Education commissions the council. It's kind of the boss. It pays for and it commissions. Very hard for the council to be fair, to not do it. It's easier for a director, a board member, such as myself, to speak out. I was a bit disappointed that not more members of the board spoke out. And then essentially, as you would know, most boards are made up of, shall we say, middle-aged people. Northern Ireland remains church-facing amongst that generation. That's the society that we came up with, church-facing, a contact with our local churches or chapels. And so it was with the people that were around me. And I had several private, difficult conversations about Catholic belief system, Presbyterian belief systems, about bringing our belief systems into our professional life. And my view was and is, if you don't bring your personal belief system into your professional life, what good are you? And well, those were, as you can imagine, those were difficult conversations. I believed, and to be fair to the council, the tide has changed. At my final meeting, I did say, I don't need to speak. The US government policy statement has done it for us. And I believe since we followed US government policy and we'll follow it in 2 years, why not do it now? And in Northern Ireland, the Minister of Education and the two top officials, maybe not the civil service though, probably align with the executive orders that President Trump signed on January the 20th. And it will be interesting to see what transpires. And one of the things I talked about in parental rights is access to local politicians. Northern Ireland is small. Everybody knows everybody. I know some of them personally. They were in the system that I'm in. I've called in to see them. Most of them, or some of them anyway, answer my emails. And parents must make their views known because some of our MLAs were elected by a handful of votes. And a handful of parents using their democratic rights will have tremendous effect on an £80,000 a year salary. And some of my local MLAs are not facing the reality of their position. And on this point, Diane, I thought I lived in a democracy. And in a democracy, our politicians should be accountable, their representatives. And the other thing that I thought I was entitled to do was to state my opinion. You don't have to agree with me, but I am entitled to state my opinion. Sadly, as you well know, that appears to be no longer the case. And we need to fight for the freedoms that I thought we fought for in a couple of world wars. I thought that's what it was all about. Religious and democratic freedoms. And if we're not careful, we're going to lose them. And our politicians need reminded that you're there because we say so. And parents need to be knocking doors and lifting phones.
There's nothing we can do that's any more important right now. I don't think individually, people get really sometimes depressed about what we cover on UK Column and they feel helpless. But one of the things that they can do, as I keep saying to our viewers, is to do things locally, find out what's going on in your schools, do what you can, write those letters, knock on those doors, make your voices heard. I'm not sure, Hugh, how much you know about my personal story in my cancellation as a librarian and an academic in the field when I left as a full professor of informatics, because basically my views were not welcomed. And even when I brought up the issues when I was, disciplined by my professional body, by CILIP, which is the professional body for librarians in the UK, as well as by my former university, my past employer, even mentioning things like my human rights to express opinions and to have religious beliefs that maybe do not align with this ideology of changing gender and these kinds of things. I was just told that I was not being inclusive, and therefore I was the problem, even, and so that my opinions were the problem, and that was why I lost my academic career. As hard as it's been in that climate, I don't regret it at all, because now I have a wonderful job with UK Column, and I'm very happy to be here because I know that I can truly now speak freely and get the truth out as much as I can, and educate and encourage others to do so. But I think unless more people start to speak up and get over the fear, that I hope that if we can find any sort of optimism in any of this, that if more people start to do what I did, that less of us will start to be as persecuted and will not lose their livelihoods as I did, be just for sharing opinions and for stating what I believe to be right and what is within my own moral compass, for standing up against some of this evil that I believe is coming into the schools and elsewhere in society. And I hope that our discussion today will start to motivate people more and more to join us, because I keep saying it's strength in numbers. We all have to do this, but unless we're aware of what's going on and are willing to do something to follow up, I don't see any other way of it changing. But I think small steps locally, if it's done all over the UK, I think can maybe start to add up to make some changes happen. And I've seen it happen locally in my own area of Edinburgh, when people were opposing 15-minute cities they kept taking down the cameras that were being placed around my neighborhood. And the council finally just stopped trying to put up the camera, because whoever it was that kept taking it down at night, made a difference. So they stopped the cameras. So that gave me a lot of hope when that happened. The fact that people were able to do it. I physically can't climb a pole to take down a camera, but somebody could. And so this is the kind of action that we need to make a difference. We're just about out of time. We have about 5 minutes left. Is there anything else that you would like to leave our viewers with today, or anything else that you want to say at all?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. We all must do what we can. Every small thing that we do adds up. And in this case, as I said to parents, if you're not going to stand up for your child now, when are you going to do it? I mean, as a principal, I was a principal for 23 years. Parents weren't slow to tell me when they thought I'd got it wrong, or when I'd lost a gym shoe, or when they didn't agree with our rules. Why be slow now? Now is the time to present yourself and to inform the governors and the principal of your views. You'll find you're in the majority. And I would urge all parents and grandparents, because you're a stakeholder, to write to the school saying you object. And it's your right to object. The school will know that your right to object and to withdraw your child, and to know when it's to be taught, and to check on the library, by the way. Dan mentioned the library. Some of the books that are in the library in our schools are horrendous. check your child's library books. Ask the school for its library books. Involve yourself. You will find that you're in the majority. You'll be in the majority in the governors, but you've got to give the governors power. Your words will give the governors and the principal power. The department's telling them to do one thing. So is Education Authority. Your words will matter to the principal and to the governors and to the chair. And they have the authority to say no. So, for the sake of your child and your grandchild, say no. I think that's me, Diane, and I want to thank you for inviting me here and to praise you and others. I didn't lose my livelihood, my position on the boards that might have been problematical because I spoke in some very frosty board meetings, let me tell you. But it wasn't my livelihood. And those of you like yourself and others who have lost their livelihoods are greatly to be admired. And it is, as Senator Kennedy, the senior, said, moral courage is what is required by our people now. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you for your time today and for speaking out. And thank you to the viewers for watching. This is Diane Rasmussen McAdie with UK Column News. Please go out there, help us make a difference, and otherwise have a wonderful day. Thank you all.